Good evening. I'm Bradley Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and on behalf of the entire staff, welcome. Or perhaps I should say, given the subject of this evening's book talk, welcome to an evening of wishful thinking.
Remember, I'm the prediction professor.
Yeah. We're delighted to have with us this evening Allan Lichtman. Allan, of course, is a history professor at American University and has been on the faculty there for 40 some odd years.
Started when I was 9.
He joined AU right after getting his PhD at Harvard. He's a popular teacher and one who's been honored for his scholarship, which has included more than half a dozen other books, including one nearly a decade ago on the rise of the American conservative movement. That book was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in nonfiction. Over the years, Allan also has shown an urge on occasion to break out of the conventional academic mold. In the early 1980s, while living in California as a visiting professor at Caltech, he appeared for 4 weeks on the TV game show Tic-Tac-Doe, winning a total of $100,000.
Then the IRS showed up.
Then in 2005, Allan entered the Democratic primary in Maryland for the U.S. Senate. He finished sixth in a field of 18, but one of his campaign ads remains legendary, at least on the AU campus. It shows Allan jumping fully clothed into a pond saying, quote, "Let's make a big splash and together change Washington."
I want to see Trump do that.
All right, well, more seriously, Allan's greatest claim to fame is his keys system, developed through analyzing presidential elections between 1860 and 1980. The system uses 13 political indicators, none of which involves polls. Instead, they're based on the theory that elections are primarily judgments by the public on the performance of the party holding the White House. Using this system, Allan, before last November's election, had correctly predicted the winner of the popular vote in every presidential election since 1984. And I'm sure we all remember the headlines last September when Allan lonely predicted that Trump would win. He also made another prediction then that didn't get as much attention. He said that if elected, Trump would eventually be impeached. That prediction wasn't based on a system. He didn't base that prediction on a system so much as he said his gut. Well, now he's elaborated on his gut feeling in a book entitled The Case for Impeachment. The book begins with some historical context, looking back at 2 previous instances of impeachment, Andrew Jackson and Bill Clinton, and one near instance, Richard Nixon. But most of the book examines all the grounds on which Trump might be removed from office: his dealings with Russia, his conflicts of interest, his tendency for overreach, his penchant for falsehoods, and so on and so on. The main caveat here being, of course, that with Trump, the nation is in such uncharted territory involving such unprecedented presidential behavior, any predictions are rather risky to make. Carlos Losada started his review of the book in the Washington Post with the question, "Too soon?" But Carlos concluded his piece saying that Allan's case for impeachment, quote, "is plausible, certainly, but it is far stronger as an argument for why Americans never should have elected Trump in the first place, yet we did, so it may not be too soon for this book after all. It may be too late." Before Allan gets up to speak, his wife is with him, Karen Strickler, and she'd also like to make a few remarks. So, ladies and gentlemen, Karen Strickler.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see so many old friends and new friends here. I am Karen Strickler, among other things. I'm Allan's wife. And I just wanted to thank Bradley and Politics and Prose for having this fantastic event to celebrate the case for impeachment, Allan's latest book. But I was remembering back to a time when Allan wrote The Keys to the White House. And that was a time when he and I had first met. And we actually had our second date here at Politics and Prose. And I just want, as a political activist myself, I just want to make one point about the book itself. And that is that people always say, when is impeachment going to happen? And it's very simple. When the American public demands it. And that's if and when the American public demands it. Remember that as you hear the rest of this lecture. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.
One thing I always have to do when I follow Karen is bring the microphone down. You know, I've been in the prediction business for a long time. And you may think it's a wonderful thing to be a forecaster, to have been so successful in so many presidential elections, to be known as the prediction professor. But let me tell you, this time I got myself into nothing but trouble. First of all, I predicted Donald Trump would win, which lost me most of my friends. But of course, gave me the support of all the pro-Trump people. Then I predicted Donald Trump would be impeached. So now I have the entire country mad at me. And that's where I stand today. So I'll talk for a little while, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. No speeches, please, and we'll get along very well if you don't ask me about the opera and don't ask me about Israel and Palestine, because I am not Jared Kushner. Now, I would love to tell you that I developed both The Keys to the White House and my latest book, The Case for Impeachment, through brilliant, deep analysis of American politics and coming up with these extraordinary ideas. But if I were to tell you that, to quote the late, not-so-great Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. I became a predictor entirely and 100% by accident. Bradley mentioned that back in 1981, I was a visiting professor at Caltech. You know, this is the place where they had all these advanced physicists and mathematicians. I could walk the campus for a day and not understand one word that anyone was saying. But they had this dinner honoring the visiting scholars, and they put me next to another odd person, and that was Volodya Kailas-Borak from Moscow, the world's leading authority in earthquake prediction. And Kailas-Borak says to me, "We are going to collaborate." And I said, of course, being foresightful and brilliant, "No, we're not." You know, earthquakes may be a big deal here in Southern California. I got to go back to Washington, D.C. Nobody cares about earthquakes. And he said, "Oh, no, I already solved earthquakes. I want to collaborate on politics." Get this. He was a member of the Soviet scientific delegation that came to Washington in 1963 to negotiate the most important treaty in the history of the world. Anybody know what that treaty was? No, what? Everyone thinks it's SALT. It's much more important than SALT. Not even close. Yes, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That's why we're all here today. So stop poisoning the atmosphere, poisoning the earth. And he said, "I always wanted to apply the methodology of earthquake prediction to elections." But he said, "I have a problem. I live in the Soviet Union. Elections, forget it. Supreme leader, off with your head. But you know a lot about politics." At this point, I thought the guy was nuts, or maybe KGB. Back when there was a KGB, of course, now under Putin, there is one again, just as a different name. And so we became collaborators. And that's how I developed The Keys to the White House, which has been successful for over 30 years and enabled me to call Donald Trump's victory a prediction, not an endorsement, mind you, although most people didn't understand that distinction. I was able to do it using my system because I ignored the polls, I didn't listen to the pundits, and by the way, I got a lot of enjoyment watching them on election night, twisting themselves into pretzels, trying to explain what they said couldn't happen, actually did happen. And I didn't follow the day-to-day events of the campaign. The keys focus our attention on the big picture, on what about the party holding the White House would motivate voters or not motivate voters to give them 4 more years. And I was able to discern so many problems facing the incumbent Democrats. And by the way, I made this prediction long before the Comey letter and doubled down on this prediction before the Comey letter. And if Democrats don't stop focusing on things that they think are to blame for their losses, they're never going to regain power in this country. They've got to get their eye back on the big picture. And of course, you might think, I had this brilliant, foresightful idea to write this book to the case for impeachment. Again, absolutely wrong. This wonderful young agent, who I never heard of, Bridget Matsey, sends me an email and says, I think you can write a bestseller. And I said, huh? I write these academic books, nobody buys them. She said, no. You're the impeachment professor. You're the guy who called Donald Trump's victory and Donald Trump's impeachment. Why don't you write a book called The Case for Impeachment? So I got to give her the credit, not myself. And by the way, when I made the prediction of Donald Trump's victory and he won the election, you'll never guess who wrote to me. Donald Trump. On the very Washington Post article where I made my prediction, he writes, "Congrats, Professor. Good call." And I have to say, I've been doing this for over 30 years, and he's the first winning candidate ever. The guy is a showman. That's the one thing he does know, and he knows really well. But I suspect he may be a showman, but he's not much of a reader, and he probably didn't drill down to my next big prediction of Donald Trump's impeachment. So why did I write this book, and what does it have to say? And by the way, I got to do a lot of thanks to HarperCollins, my publisher. This was the fastest they had ever, and they're a huge publisher, maybe one of the biggest in the world, so the fastest they ever put out a serious book. 3 months for the writing, production, and publication. We call it the miracle baby, because it really is. And when you read the book, you'll see it's not dashed off. It's got 300 footnotes, all kinds of facts, lots of information. So, why did I write this book, aside from writing a bestseller and listening to this sharp young woman agent? I wrote this book because I believe that every American, everyone around the world, needs to be concerned about our constitutional order, our liberties, our freedoms, and now that we're eyeball to eyeball with the North Koreans, even our national security and peace around the world. And I wrote this book not as punditry and not as politics. I do not quote a single Democratic critic of Donald Trump in the book. I wrote the book essentially as the people's guide to impeachment. Because as my wonderful political organizer wife said and always reminds me, impeachment is really in the hands of the people. And impeachment will happen when the people demand it. In the book, I go back to the foundation of impeachment. Because a lot of people misunderstand what impeachment is all about. The framers explicitly put impeachment not in the courts, but in an elected body, the United States Congress. All that it takes to impeach a president is a majority vote of the Congress. And there's no appeal. There's no check. It's absolute. Of course, a president is not removed by impeachment, There's a higher bar for that. An impeached president is then tried by the United States Senate, and it takes a 2/3 vote to remove the president. So they put it in the hands of a political body, not a legal body. And that means impeachment is not a strictly legal process. It is a combined legal, moral, and political process. And it doesn't require an indictable crime to impeach. We quote the great expounder of the American Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, in The Federalist, who said, impeachment will proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. And they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. Basically, we're talking about abuse of presidential power. That's how the framers understood impeachment. And as I point out in the book, they put impeachment into the Constitution, very advisedly, as a constitutional, orderly, peaceful process for removing a rogue president and safeguarding our democracy. And this was an alternative to the ways in which rulers at the time were removed by assassination or revolution. The other thing that's critical to understand about the nature of impeachment is that it's not an apocalyptic or a traumatic event. And the framers did not expect it to be. The first president to be impeached was Andrew Johnson. When? 1868. And what was going on in 1868? Reconstruction. The reintegration of freed slaves into American life. And the basic reason Johnson was impeached was he was impeding this process. He was impeached. He fell one vote short of conviction in the Senate. And it was good for the country because the chastised president in the last months of his term moderated his obstruction, and Reconstruction was allowed to proceed on a much sounder basis. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was not impeached, but he resigned because the leadership of his party told him two things. You're going to be impeached and you're going to be convicted. And the ever pragmatic Nixon decided, I'd rather resign. Was that a bad thing for the country? No. It removed a president who was a threat to our Constitution, to our political process through his dirty tricks, and who was corrupting the institutions of government. Third president, of course, was whom? Bill Clinton, who was not convicted either, but he was impeached. And that did not weaken the presidency. It didn't weaken the Democratic Party at the time. Democrats actually won House seats in the midst of the impeachment crisis. First time any presidential party had done that since 1934 in Franklin Roosevelt. And the presidency emerged stronger than ever. Some would say too strong under George W. Bush. So impeachment need not be this traumatic, apocalyptic kind of event. Generally, the results of impeachment have, in fact, been positive. They've been a plus, not a minus for the country, and that is what the framers understood when they put this into the Constitution. I spend a lot of time talking about Richard Nixon because of the three presidents who were impeached or faced impeachment, his transgressions were clearly the most serious. And I draw a lot of critical parallels that you'll see when you read the book in depth between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. Look, history is never perfectly linear, and there are obvious differences between the two men, right? Trump was born to riches. Nixon was born to very modest circumstances. Nixon was an experienced politician. Trump was a businessman. Fair enough. But look at some of the chilling comparisons between the two men that I think explain a lot of what's happening under Donald Trump. Both men see themselves as beset by enemies. And they see the world as black and white between enemies and loyalists. And I use the word loyalists, not friends, very advisedly. Both of them waged war against the press. In fact, I've got some quotes in the book from both Nixon and Trump and their team, and you couldn't tell the difference. If you shuffled those words up, you couldn't tell which came from the Nixon team and which came from the Trump team. Neither man was guided by a strong set of core internalized principles. Rather, they tended to think fundamentally about what is good for themselves. Neither man had much respect for American traditions, for telling the truth, or for the law. And these comparisons with Richard Nixon helped guide me to discover, as Bradley pointed out, 8 separate possible grounds for the impeachment of Donald Trump. No president has ever, in the history of our country, ever entered the White House so vulnerable to impeachment. And that's why I'm predicting that impeachment is going to occur. I'm not going to take the time to go through all 8 grounds. You've got to read the book to discover them, of course. I'm not going to give it all away in half an hour, right? I assume you're all here to buy a book or get out, you know. I'm just going to go over a few. The most likely ground is the Russian connection. And I have a whole chapter on the Russian connection. And I'm not going to go through it all, but by the way, the Russian connection is far deeper than anyone has talked about except in this book. It goes back well more than a decade when Donald Trump partnered with a group called the Bayrock Group on at least 4 and more real estate ventures, all of which, by the way, failed, like Soho in New York, the Tampa Trump Tower, Fort Lauderdale Trump Tower. And these guys were fist and glove with what were known as the Kazakh oligarchs from the Russian state of Kazakhstan, and likely tied in with the Russians as well. And Trump tried real hard to get the Bayrock Group to work out deals for Trump ventures in Moscow. For some reason, it didn't work out. And one of the principals of the Bayrock Group was a guy named Felix Sater. And he emerged again just a few months ago out of the shadows. He goes deep into the Trump history. He was one of 3 individuals who went to the then, or now, I think he was always disgraced, but now disgraced General Flynn, and presented him a plan to eliminate the Russian sanctions. Someone from deep into Trump's past and Trump's connection with the Russians. But let's talk about the rub here. Collusion with the Russians. No president has ever entered the White House under 3 investigations for possible serious federal crime, the FBI and 2 committees of the Congress. And I say serious because the crimes are serious. I'm not yet convinced the House and Senate investigations are serious, but we'll see. We'll find out whether Republicans really have the backbone to seriously investigate this issue. Now, we don't know what the answer is, but presume for a moment that the investigations do reveal that the Trump team was colluding with the Russians in their reprehensible attack on our democracy and the integrity of our elections. And I call it an attack advisedly. It wasn't a military attack, but it was still an attack that undermines the foundations of our society. So if they come up with that, and Trump knew about it, that's a serious crime. It's called misprision of treason. Hard one to pronounce, but basically it means not reporting treasonous activity. Worse yet, heaven forbid, what if the investigations reveal that Trump himself was involved with colluding with the Russians, as this a dossier produced by this former British intelligence agency charges? Then Trump could become the first president to be charged with treason, an explicit ground for impeachment under the Constitution. We don't know, but there sure is a lot of smoke, and I believe there is some fire behind it. I don't know if they'll uncover it. And if you look at the response of the Trump administration to today, to the news that came out today about what Carter Page said, oh, if you really want to get the story about the Russian collusion, look at the Obama administration. Right. Yeah, they really benefited from that, didn't they? It has all the hallmarks of a Nixon-type cover-up. Deny, conceal, deceive, deflect. And then when you're caught, say, oh, any contacts we had with the Russians were just innocuous. Just like the Nixon team, remember, said Watergate was a third-rate burglary. There's lots of other evidence about the Russian connection in the book, and I'll leave it there as a tease for you to read the whole book. Second, most likely, conflicts of interest. Oh my gosh. It's in the news today as well, right? They're pitching, the Kushner family is pitching deals to the Chinese, and touting their ties, to the administration. It's incredible. I have actually, because Donald Trump was so nice to me and wrote me this letter, I decided I'd be nice to him, and I wrote a chapter in my book called The Way Out, in which I say, Donald Trump, here's how you can change course and not be impeached. Of course, he's not listening to any of it, but that's another matter. They never listen. So, one of the things I recommend, first thing I recommend in The Way Out is divest. Get rid of your business ventures. Now, of course, he would take a financial hit, but the guy's a billionaire. He'd still be a billionaire, and no one forced him to run for president of the United States. Yeah, he supposedly turned his businesses over to his kids. But by the way, I don't know if any of you remember that press conference with all those folders that are supposedly contracts. There are some pictures of them. Guess what they're likely to be? Blank pages. So we don't even know what he's done. But leave that aside. He still profits from every one of his ventures at home and abroad. And we don't even know what those ventures are because he refuses to release his taxes, unlike every other president. And being under audit is no bar to releasing your taxes. Lots of presidents have done that. He hasn't released his taxes, not because he hasn't paid enough. That he can get by, but because I believe he has lots more ties to foreign countries. Now, there is something in the Constitution that no one has heard of until recently, right? Anybody know what I'm talking about, this clause? The Emoluments Clause, right? Which, by the way, was not an afterthought. The Emoluments Clause was a central element of the Constitution because the framers were very fearful of foreigners corrupting our government. Alexander Hamilton said, foreign influence is the Grecian horse, the Trojan horse of our republic. And the Emoluments Clause basically says, in archaic language, that if you're the president, you can't take anything of value from a foreign government, their entities, or their agents. And by the way, it's an absolute clause. It does not require a quid pro quo and does not specify any amount. And already, Donald Trump is crashing into the Emoluments Clause. I'll give you one example. As president, he got final approval for 38 potentially lucrative trademarks from the nation of China. And although the clause doesn't require a quid pro quo, guess what he didn't do? And you all know what he didn't do. Declare China a currency manipulator on day one of his presidency. And he's got lots of other similar conflicts all over the world. But look at home. It's not covered by the Emoluments Clause, but you don't have to have an explicit violation if the threat is serious enough, and the threat is immense here. He has hundreds of businesses here at home, all of which stand to profit from decisions the administration makes on trade, on labor, on regulations, and perhaps most of all, on taxes. I'm not a tax analyst, but tax analysts have looked at Trump's tax plan that he just released, and Trump personally stands to gain hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars by reducing his business income tax to 15%, eliminating the alternative minimum tax, and abolishing the estate tax. Hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. And here's the rub. And here's why we have an Emoluments Clause. And we do have domestic laws as well about whether or not people associated with a president can financially benefit from presidential inside information. One of the is called the Stock Act. Here's the rub. We, the American people, and the United States Congress should not have to be guessing on where the national interest leaves off and Trump's pocketbook interests kick in. Now, third thing I want to talk about is the edgiest, one that kind of the Washington Post reviewer kind of dismissed as being too far out, but in some ways is the most serious. And that is impeachment for a crime against humanity. Don't laugh. I know we associate crimes against humanity typically with genocide, like what happened in Cambodia in the 1970s, or horrifically in the Holocaust. Don't even get me started on how the Trump team deals with the Holocaust. That was my last book, FDR and the Jews. But, all right. However, the International Criminal Court, which prosecutes genocides, has recently put a new priority on crimes against the environment, which would include catastrophic climate change. My wife, who's a climate activist, runs a climate change PAC, alerted me to all of these things that are going on with climate change. Now, let me quote you something. In 2009, a group of businessmen wrote a letter to then President Barack Obama. This is more than 7 years ago. And they said, the science is irrefutable, that unless we take strong action against climate change, the consequences are going to be catastrophic for our planet. And they went on to say, doing this won't hurt the economy, it'll help the economy by moving us into a new economic era. Guess who signed that letter? Donald J. Trump, Ivanka Trump, Eric Trump, and Donald Jr. What has changed in 7+ years? Science is even more compelling. Over 97% of scientists who publish in this area are in agreement. The threat is more immediate and more urgent. You can read about it every day. So what has changed is only Donald Trump's political calculation that to make it in the Republican Party, he had to join the discredited ranks of the deniers, or at minimum of the skeptics. And he has taken so many policies that not only halt progress in dealing with climate change, but throttle back progress. The Donald Trump of 2009 would be the first one calling for the impeachment of Donald Trump today. How much more time do I have? A couple minutes. All right. So, I want to end this by saying that my book is not a rant against Donald Trump. I actually have some warm feelings for Donald Trump after he sent me that letter. And I'm rooting for him. I hope he reads my chapter on the way out and does everything I recommended him, including firing Steve Bannon. And by the way, cutting the Mussolini Act. I mean, some of the worst things he said is his praise for people like Vladimir Putin and Rodrigo Duterte, you may not have heard of in the Philippines. He's a serial murderer. He's murdered thousands of his own people in the name of a phony war against drugs. Or even saying Kim Jong-un is a smart cookie for holding power. How does Kim Jong-un get power? By murdering his opponents, by jailing his opponents and letting millions of people starve in his country so he could build up his military machine. This is just shocking. And by the way, I will be on MSNBC tomorrow at about 4:30 talking about Donald Trump and the dictators. So cut the Mussolini Act, but he hasn't done it. Now, I think this book should be read by everyone, whether you're a pro-Trump or anti-Trump. If you're pro-Trump, you want to see what's going on, and you want to see, where your idol is vulnerable. It is the People's Guide to Impeachment, solidly grounded in the history of impeachment, the process of impeachment, Trump's history prior to the presidency, a history of lying, of flouting the law, of earlier conflicts of interest, and the record of the first couple of months of the Trump administration. Trump has spent his whole life, and this is one of the things that really struck me when I began thinking about this. Think about this. Trump has spent his whole life avoiding accountability for anything. He's declared bankruptcy. He's protracted litigation. He's settled litigation for peanuts. He's threatened and sued his critics. He's walked away from failed business ventures like the one I talk about in the book in Tampa and Fort Lauderdale and left other people suffering and holding the bag, like the people who put down payments on those condominiums, on these brilliant Trump towers that are now holes in the ground and nothing more. So he spent his whole life in many ways avoiding accountability. And here's the real secret of why he loves dictators. Because he realizes in a democratic system, unlike Putin's Russia or Rodrigo Duterte's Philippines, you are accountable in a democratic system. You can't declare bankruptcy. You can't just walk away. You can't settle things out by paying money. And he hates being accountable. And the ultimate accountability is impeachment. And impeachment will occur if the American people demand it. We've seen all this anti-Trump energy, all of these demonstrations, all of these protests. But you know what? It'll be like smoke through a chimney unless it's directed to a particular end. Of course, Donald Trump doesn't care. You can get as many people in the street as you want. You can call him out on 1,000 lies, and he doesn't care because Donald Trump has no shame. None whatsoever. He can't be shamed. He can only be forced into things. So all of this energy has got to be directed to two ends. One, electoral politics, and two, impeachment, if that is warranted. And by the way, might a Republican Congress move to impeach him? You bet. It would only take I point out in the book, some 24 Republicans if Democrats stand firm to get a House majority. And what is the ultimate priority of office holders? Survival. And if Trump becomes a liability to the survival of Republicans in the House in 2018, you could certainly envision some 24 turning against him. 23 Republicans now sit in seats won by Hillary Clinton in 2016. You know, after the 2000 election, and I actually know what happened in Florida because I did the study for the United States Commission on Civil Rights, I thought nothing could top that, right? Little did I know and little did I expect. So I now take my guiding philosophy from that late, great philosopher, Saturday Night Live's Rosanna Dana, who famously said, "There's always something." Thank you so much. I'll take your questions now. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Where are the mics?
So we have
Thank you.
some time for questions.
Thank you. Wow.
If you have a question, please try to make your way to a microphone here. And is there a microphone?
And we have a lot of people, so keep them short.
Yeah, microphone over there, because we are recording this event to put it up on our YouTube channel. So we appreciate.
You're on record,
Appreciate if you could speak from the microphone. Thank you.
so you can't call me names.
Allan, Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation has the power to review tax returns.
That's correct.
And does regularly all the time.
Correct.
I worked there in '74 because of Watergate as a young economist.
God,
and
just when I came to you.
yeah, and I quickly learned that Mr. Nixon had cheated like crazy on 3 years and
no
walked away
kidding.
because of the pardon that Mr. Ford signed on $424,000 of liability.
That's why he was pardoned. One of the reasons.
Now, once that, in my opinion, that's what convinced Republican leaders to go further into the Watergate investigation. I wonder if you agree. And
Yeah, good point.
And would Mr. Hatch in the Senate and Mr. Brady, who are chair and co-chair of the Joint Committee, do this?
I can't say whether they'll do it, but they certainly have the power. And if the conflicts of interest continue and become worse, I think they will do it. There are other ways in which his taxes could be released as well. Either congressional committee that's investigating the Russian connection could subpoena his taxes if they decide the tax returns are relevant, and I'm sure they are, and the FBI could subpoena the tax returns. And by the way, Article 3 of the 3 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon in the House Judiciary Committee, disobeying Congress's subpoenas. Thank you.
So there's supposed to be a microphone over there, but there isn't one. So we're going to set one up right now. But in the meantime, we'll just go with this mic.
Hi, thank you. I agree with everything you said, and I think there's many cases for impeachment. However, don't you think that realistically the Democrats would have to take over both houses, both the House and the Senate, because a lot of what you talk about, they already know this. And I really feel like what Trump said in his debate, that somebody, and he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and nobody would care. That's how I look at most of the Republicans right now.
Well, you make a great point. You make a great point, which is why I emphasize the power of the people. The Congress is like Wall Street. It runs on two principles, fear and greed. And right now the Republicans are still in the greed phase, having, just won this election. It's up to the people to put them into the fear phase and make them fearful for their survival unless they don't act strongly. And then if they don't, you could have a wave election and the Democrats could take over the House, in which case all the political calculations shift. Thank you.
Thank you.
What about the 25th Amendment? And also, do you think that Mr. Trump is capable of attempting a coup if his power is threatened?
Oh my gosh. Let me deal with the first question. Is the FBI here? First question is really interesting. I have a whole chapter on that. People don't realize there is a way of removing a president other than impeachment. It's very, very difficult, but it's under the 25th Amendment to the Constitution that was adopted in 1967. Under this amendment, if a majority of the cabinet, which of course is appointed by the president and the vice president, decide a president is unfit to carry out his duties, you go through a process. I'm not going to go through it all, but ultimately, if the president resists, it's thrown into the Congress, and if 2/3 of the Congress agree that the president is unfit to carry out his duties, then the president is removed independent of impeachment. And by the way, you got to read the whole chapter to get all of this, but I'll just say right now that the 25th Amendment is not limited to physically unable to carry out duties. One could also be mentally unfit to carry out duties.
Hi. I like a lot what you said about everything, but especially about the deep history with Russia.
Yeah.
But some of the things that I've read, and I'm not an attorney, but if you can clarify perhaps, is that...
I'm not an attorney either, thank goodness.
Okay, but...
No offense to attorneys in the room.
Yeah, likewise. The word treason comes up a lot when discussing what's going on, and of course in conjunction with Russia. But there's also, from what I've read, people who say that to be considered treason, an act has to aid and comfort an actual enemy of the U.S. that we're at war with. Russia's an adversary, perhaps, but we're not at war with them. So.
Well, a couple of things. A great question. And I'm not a lawyer, so, don't run out and, say, Lichtman gave us this legal analysis. First of all, I think it's arguable Russia did attack us and did wage war against us. Modern warfare is not necessarily with bullets and bombs. Modern warfare can be cyber warfare, sure. And it can be in many ways as dangerous. So I think there's an argument to be made for that. And secondly, for impeachment, you don't have to fit the legal definition of a crime. If Congress decides that this in effect constitutes treason, regardless of the technical elements of treason, they could still proceed with impeachment. They do not have to follow statute law.
And a quick follow-up, if I may. Acts committed before inauguration, are they impeachable?
The Constitution has no provisions that limit impeachment only to acts conducted while you're in office. In fact, there was a federal judge, I think his name was Judge Porteous, I point this out in the book, who was impeached at least in part on acts he committed before he took the bench. And one of the senators in a colloquy, this had to do with the impeachment of Bill Clinton, pointed out that impeachment can take place for acts committed before a president takes the oath of office. Anybody know who that senator was? Secret's in the book, but I'll give it to you. Jeff Sessions.
All right, thank you.
Book. Documented. So, I'll go back and forth between the two.
A small question and a big question. The small question is, my understanding of the Emoluments Clause is that it does have a sentence in it that says that Congress can let them off the hook if they wish.
But they have to approve it first. They can't let him off the hook later.
No, that's what I mean. But I'm saying
But they
the,
haven't.
the Republicans have done that de facto, but not de jure. But they could choose to do
They
it.
could
de jure.
choose to, but I think that would be politically suicide for the Republicans to say it's okay for you to, have foreign governments helping you out in your. I don't think even Republicans would take that political risk.
Who knows?
Go on. What's your big question?
The big question is related to the one you just dodged, which is,
I don't think I dodged it.
Well, no. I think the distinction between Trump and Nixon is that Trump is crazier, a lot
Oh my
crazier.
God, that's really scary.
Okay.
Because Richard Nixon was nuts.
He was nuts, but for instance, he had the sense to hide it. He did it all in secret. This guy does it right out in front of
Well, that's an
in front of the
excellent
world.
point. Nixon, they're both secretive in that, Trump even had one of his wives sign a confidentiality agreement. When the Senate aides helped him with his travel ban, he had them sign. But Trump is much more out front. A lot of Nixon's comments on the press, for example, were not public. They were private comments. Trump has been much more out front in declaring press as enemies. So I agree with you. I think you're right. This way. I'd love to have you ask another one, but we have 100 people asking questions. We got to move over here. No one there? Okay, we'll just stick to this.
Okay, thank you for coming here. 2 questions.
Are you a student?
I'm a high school student. I came here.
Excellent. Don't be embarrassed. That's great. Where?
So 2 questions. The first,
Where you in school?
Oakton High School in Vienna, Virginia.
Sure.
So the 2 questions I would have are, one, Republicans, the party in Congress is still the party of Lincoln and Reagan, and therefore they might like Mike Pence more than Donald Trump. And one of the
It's in the book.
lazier pieces
So you should have written this book.
well,
I
one
talk
of-
about that in the book.
Yes. So one of the lazier pieces of conventional wisdom is that Trump is much more moderate than Mike Pence. So does that
Great question. And I talk about that. The political calculations are complicated for the Democrats. On the one hand, Trump is dangerous and they may want to get rid of him. But on the other hand, hey, let's have Donald Trump to kick around for 4 more years rather than the more dangerous Pence. But so far, Trump has not been very moderate. I spent a lot of time talking about the disastrous policies on climate change. I'm not here to talk policy, but the health care plan could not be much further to the right. It's really, not according to me, but according to the Congressional Budget Office, it's going to knock 24 million people off the rolls and give a huge tax break to the very, very rich. So, Karen and I talked about this a lot, and we said, Trump's kind of a wild card. Maybe he'll come out as moderate. Maybe he'll even go for a carbon tax and, not. It hasn't worked out that way. And look at the people he's put into office. I mean, my goodness. Jeff Sessions couldn't get a federal judgeship because he, in a Republican Congress, by the way, denied him a federal judgeship because of alleged racism. Thank you.
Thank you.
And tell all your teachers in your high school to buy the book.
Dr. Lichtman. Sir?
Oh, we do?
Excuse me. You were there first.
Crime against humanity seems sort of a reach.
I understand. But it should be discussed.
But there are other crimes like money laundering, with several very well publicized episodes before he became president.
Before he became president. I talk about a lot of crimes.
Those are very
before he became
palpable
president.
crimes.
I agree. I have a whole chapter called Flouting the Law.
So why don't we hear more about cases that's
You do if you read the book. It's all in there. I have a whole chapter on that called Flouting the Law. And, not just what you mentioned, but let me mention a couple of really egregious ways in which he violated the law. And this is well documented. He broke the Cuban embargo in the 1990s when that was a serious federal crime. And when he was going around, of course, praising and touting the Cuban embargo. He can't be prosecuted for that because the statute of limitations have long run out. And there are at least 2 instances in which this guy who's premised his campaign in opposition to illegal immigration, you know what he did? He employed, according to, again, very solid evidence, illegal immigrants to clear the land for Trump Tower because he could work them practically to death and pay them almost nothing. And his modeling agency employed illegal immigrants as well. So there's lots of stuff that I talk about in the book that he flouted the law prior to becoming president. And I also point out that's a warning sign that he might not have much respect for the law as president. Thank you.
I'll do just one other question, quick question. What can people do to encourage impeachment whose representatives in Congress are both Democratic and whose senators are Democratic?
I'll let
besides
my
showing up in the
organizer
streets,
wife answer
besides
that.
showing up in the streets and writing checks to pop up.
You got to get these people to be active in the movement. Some have. I went to Stuyvesant High School in New York City. Some of you may have heard of it. And my old debate partner, I was a debater at Stuyvesant, was Jerry Nadler, who's now representative. And he has actually introduced an impeachment resolution, which of course, and I'm not sure she's introduced it, Maxine Waters, Sheila Jackson Lee. There are some Democrats who are now beginning to pursue it. But this isn't going to move, frankly, until we get the results of the Russia investigation. That's probably what it would take to move Republicans. But there are a couple other things brewing, quickly, because I want to get to your question. A group here in Washington called Crew has filed a lawsuit charging Trump with violating the Emoluments Clause. And there is a suit called Juliana versus Trump, the children's suit, which is suing Trump for destroying their future because of his throttling back on climate change. So things are percolating.
I can't really reach this. Hooray, thank you. I'd be grateful to hear your opinion of Mr. Pence. One reason I'm so interested is I live in Chevy Chase, D.C., 2 blocks from the house into which he moved for 2 months.
Well, you probably know him better than I do then.
Well, within a day, there were 225 rainbow flags in the immediate neighborhood. Now there are more than 325, and the one on my front porch is still hanging, and most of them are.
Yeah.
They're even sticking little flags in flower pots.
I don't really talk in great depth about Mike Pence, except to say he is a very predictable, down-the-line, evangelical Christian conservative, very hostile to abortion rights,
Yes.
to gay and lesbian rights, and has a very negative record on those rights in Indiana. But he's not Donald Trump.
So he's not as dangerous.
He's not as dangerous.
Professor, I'm a proud former student of
Of course.
Proud former student of yours. I apologize for that. My question for you is when you talk about impeachment. I mean, this is a semantics question. Are you talking also about the Senate removing him? Because technically, I know only the House has the Senate only has the power to impeach.
Of
but
course.
even the most optimistic people feel that Democrats are not going to be able to flip the Senate next year because the map is
They're not going to flip the Senate, and it requires 2/3 of the Senate anyway.
Yeah, but where do my question is where did the 19? I mean, there are 48 Democrats plus Sanders plus King. Where did the 19? Where would you say?
48 count Sanders and King, actually. Yeah, I got you. So where are the 19 Republicans going to come from? That's much harder. That's as I explained, I think, at the very beginning of my talk, and I talk about in the book, that's a much harder hurdle. The 2 presidents who were actually impeached, neither one of them was convicted by the Senate. Bill Clinton didn't come close. He was like 17 votes short of conviction. Andrew Johnson was 1 vote short. So you would have, even under the best scenario for 2018, even if the Democrats flipped the Senate, which is very unlikely, they would have a very bare majority. And again, that's where the people have to come in and make the case. Because senators, no less than members of Congress, are responsible to the people. People would have to weigh in. And it would also depend on what basis if he's impeached. If he's impeached on treason, then I think, he's probably going to be convicted by the Senate, regardless of the political calculation.
So we have time for one more question.
One more, and then I'm going to sign books.
It's me again, but and you already answered most of this, maybe, but with the
I've tried.
two-thirds threshold to remove. But speak, if you would, please, a little bit about the danger of the impeachment process becoming overly politicized, similar to the way we now confirm Supreme Court justices. And people say the hypothesis is if Hillary Clinton had won, then the current Republican Senate would have already been moving, and House and Senate would have been moving to remove her. Likewise, if Bill Clinton had faced a Republican
Sure.
Senate, he might have been thrown out.
Well, a bunch of there were several Republicans who actually voted to acquit him. It wasn't strictly along party
So the
lines.
over-politicized the way recalls are in the Supreme Court.
Unfortunately, great question. Unfortunately, the Chinese have a saying. It's called "May you live in interesting times." That certainly applies today. And one of the things that make things interesting but sad is we now have probably the most polarized politics since the Civil War. And of course, if Andrew Jackson had been alive, we wouldn't have had a Civil War. That's a whole other question. And I'm treading on some dangerous ground here, and the best I can do is, as I say in the book, you should not be impeaching Donald Trump because you don't like his politics. You probably will like Pence's politics worse, actually, or as bad. That's not a ground for impeachment. You should not impeach Donald Trump because he's unconventional, because you don't like his style. We only should be moving to impeachment if, as Alexander Hamilton said it exactly right, the abuse or violation of some public trust relating chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. And I think it's a good thing, perhaps, that you would need Republicans to come along to impeach and certainly to convict Donald Trump. One of the things that forced Nixon to resign was the defection of Republicans. I think I mentioned in the House Judiciary Committee more than a third of Republicans defected to vote for at least one article of impeachment against Richard Nixon. Thank you very much. I'll sign everyone's book. Thank you.